This tutorial is part of a YouTube course playlist and a Udemy course. You can access the first phases of this course on YouTube or the whole course at Udemy. Links to both can be found in the video description. For anyone who's new to environment variables, a quick introduction. Environment variables are variables that are set at the operating system level. They are accessible to all processes running on that system. So that includes our application that we're developing. So they are commonly used in software development to store configuration settings, sensitive information, and other environment-specific values. So why do we use these? Well, generally we avoid storing, or we want to avoid storing sensitive information directly in our code base. So imagine we have an application. Within our application, we need connectivity over to our database. So we're going to need a username and password. So one approach might be to add the username and password into our application, so it actually then makes that connection to our database. So we want to try to, where possible, avoid storing any sensitive information directly in code or configuration files. Instead, we want to potentially use environment variables to store such information. So instead of actually assigning the environment variables in our application, we basically just make a reference to the environment variable. So let's, for example, we'd create a link, if you like, or a reference to an environment variable within our application. The actual environment variable is going to be stored within our operating system. So here in the operating system, we would actually define an environment variable, user equals, and then whatever the username is. And that way the application can then utilize this variable to actually build that connection across to the database without actually defining it within our application. So instead of defining username and passwords and sensitive information within our app, we simply go ahead and create at the operating system level some environment variables. So we can create an environment variable called, for example, user. That would have some sort of username. And then the application, within the application, we can then go ahead and reference this environment variable, and then that can then be utilized to build the connection across to the database as per usual. As a single user developing an application, this doesn't really have much of an effect, but it is good practice and it's well worth knowing. Environment variables can offer a secure, flexible, and portable approach to managing configuration settings and sensitive information, particularly in production server environments. By decoupling configuration from application code and deployment artifacts, environment variables enable better security, scalability, and agility in managing production applications. Ultimately, it's a good practice to follow. Now, while we're developing the application, we don't want the hassle of creating our environment variables by actually assigning them to the computer and so on. So here we have python.env, which is a Python library that allows us to manage application configurations and sensitive information using environment variables. This library is going to help us load the environment variables from a .env file into our Python application and generally manage our environment variables while we're developing within our development environment. If you read through here, you notice there's something called the 12-factor principles. And this is important if you haven't come across this 12-factor principles, the 12-factor app. This 12-factor app set of principles or best practices is for building modern, scalable, and maintainable software. So it outlines 12 principles that aim to guide developers in creating robust and portable applications that can easily scale and adapt to changing environments. It's well worth having a read through. If you take a look at the third principle here of the 12 factors, this is related to storing configuration in environment variables to separate configuration from code. Right, so next up in the next tutorial, we'll go ahead and install setup in preparation for us to utilize with initially the Docker environment variables.